So when I was about 20 years old and I stumbled into literally stumbled into therapy, and was lucky enough that my first therapist was this really gifted childhood trauma therapist who started to do some individual work with me, and then she quickly had me join a group. And I was in a group with 7 other childhood trauma survivors, and I was kind of like the mascot because I was, what would this been? I was about 19 or 20 when I got to her. And everyone else was sort of maybe like mid 30s, into their 40s. So I was this kind of scrappy mascot. And the structure of that group, about 6 months into it, this thing happened. And the structure of the group was everyone sort of checked in the beginning of group to talk about like 3 to 5 minutes about how their emotional week was with parenting their inner child, or issues or triggers that came up, or emotions that came up. Then there's the content of the group, and then there's like a closing, which is sort of a check out, which is to talk about what the group was like for you. And we're doing very, very specific trauma-related things, childhood trauma-related things for the course of that whole work. But anywho, in this one group, this great guy checked in sort of first, and he was going through a really bad divorce. Like emotionally bad. It wasn't like nasty. It was just sort of like heartbreaking for him. And he was really talking about being devastated by the process of that, divorce. And I didn't even know that him talking about the pain in that way was triggering to me. And as the other people checked in when it got to me, I just sort of nervously said like, yeah, I'm going through girlfriend problems too. Which wasn't, I was always going through girlfriend problems, but the way that I said it and the content of being 20 and having girlfriend problems is a different level than being in your 30s and going through a divorce, of being married to someone for 10 years or however long he was married to. So there was something about my energy, and there was something about the way that I was trying to validate him, but it sort of really, really failed. And then we focused on what I said for the entire group, which was hard enough, but that's kind of how the work is sort of done. And when the therapist, focused on me, and because it was, I really pissed this person off with the way that I sort of said this stuff to him. They could tell that I was triggered, or there was something going on with me. And the therapist just sort of, like, well, what happened for you when, he was talking about his divorce, to look back about what happened for me, but also to explore what did it take me back to in childhood. And I don't know where this came from, but the thought just kind of came to me like, well, my mom was a time bomb. And whenever she was in pain, my job was to kind of contain it. So if I didn't contain it, my mom would stay in that stuff. I was a little therapist for my mom. So I would sort of try to validate or try to get out of it. But I was conditioned that when other people were in pain, that activated my body in some way. I wasn't being able to be present. And I, because of the way I was raised, I usually sort of said the wrong thing. It was very, very difficult for me to sort of be in the room with people who were in pain because of the way that I was raised. And that's what this video is really going to be all about. And the greatest, the stuff that happened later in that session, and what this very sort of kind and generous man, even though I pissed him off, what he said to me changed me forever. So that was a very powerful thing about looking under the microscope in a safe environment about how I behaved around other people, which is why I love group therapy. So this is what this video is going to be about, the triggering stuff that happens when we try to validate. And for the purpose of this video, let's think about it with your response. What would it be like, exactly like that scenario? What would it be like for you guys to think about a hypothetical? If a really good friend to you came to you and said that they were getting a divorce that they were not fully expecting after a very long-term relationship with somebody. That's going to be the whole premise of this video, to kind of keep that in your mind about what would happen to you if someone was in that position, and how would you struggle being present with them, struggle being valid, because there's many different ways that the dysfunction can come up around validation. So this video is a follow-up video. I did a recent video, a role play video about abusive and validating parents, and I walked through like 7 or 8 different types of abusive parents, the way that they would be invalidating to their adult children. And in that video, I reference that there's an addition, a whole other cast of triggers that happen when we're giving validation to somebody. So that's going to be the focus on this. When kids grow up in abusive households like mine, feedback gets wrecked in both giving and receiving validation or seeing other people. As childhood trauma survivors growing up, we didn't witness sincere empathy, most likely, or right-sized holding space for someone when they're in pain. We probably saw the opposite of that, where the adults, or that how the adults validated others was really off. You might have just noticed that when you're a kid about like, what are you doing there? And it's pretty messy in terms of what's knowing what's healthy and what it means to be fully available to people if you grew up in sort of a dysfunctional family system. In my childhood trauma groups, members are learning to give and receive feedback pretty much in each group. And just like the group that I was in, I do the same model. And they're learning for the first time to be emotionally present and emotionally vulnerable in and around safe people in a safe environment, because we didn't get that growing up. They hear each other's stories, they share their stuck places and their triggers, and that's pretty much the whole group process, is giving and receiving feedback. And it gradually, that concept, it gradually fixes those issues slowly over time. Is really at the heart of it is being emotional and being vulnerable in a safe environment, which is, we should be getting that from the way that we're raised, but none of us really do. What we usually witness in our abusive or dysfunctional family system is any of the following. Parents criticizing or giving advice up front, like parents being threatened by the emotions of others. Like sort of, you could picture picture my dad and this, coworker gets divorced and like, well, Tim, I imagine you'll have to move on and maybe get good and drunk and then put yourself back in the bachelor circulation next week. And let's hope the alimony doesn't suck up all your 401k. Like very caustic, very negative, very, just sort of kind of gross, really, to be blunt, is the way that I would see my dad try to validate people. Or, he would just, he approached life with this really toxic sarcasm. Another example is parents not knowing what to say and giving canned responses like, plenty of fish in the sea, sun will come out tomorrow, I'm sure you'll be okay when you wake up, that kind of stuff. Another example is parents taking it over and making it about them, like we saw in that role-playing video. Another example is parents going over the top and overwhelming the other person with care, which is another way that they can make it about themselves. Parents being cold and skipping the person's upset by changing the subject, like, oh, look, it's gonna rain next week, like that kind of stuff. And you can see a lot of such behaviors in that role play that I mentioned earlier. So this is what was modeled for us, and it wasn't contrasted by any healthy examples, so we don't really have a frame of reference about what it means to really be present for somebody when they're in pain. Much of our lives are, I know that this was true for me, much of our lives are about copycatting or watching healthy behavior. There's a wonderful author about group therapy, his name is Irvin Yalom, and he talks about that. That's one of his 11 therapeutic principles of good group psychotherapy, is we learn healthier behaviors from healthy people. I got healthier modeling from strangers in my recovery than I did from my own family system. So if any of you feel bad, like you're, copying behaviors or anything like that, that's kind of how it's done. That's how I got here. So plenty, more of that. So don't think about that as a negative thing, or you're not being authentic. Most of us are guessing what healthy looks like, which is kind of better than replicating what our parents did. I think it's better to shoot in the dark and guess than to sort of do what they did, which is a thing we'll cover later. We all have blind spots when it comes to being available to people because of the intimacy that we experience in our family systems. So when we give validation as survivors, our dysfunctional response might look like any of the following. We might really struggle with whether the feedback we give is good enough. And that can lead to having shame attacks. I can't believe I said that, like all that stuff. Overly take on the person's situation or feelings on the issue, like we absorb it, like we're responsible for it, or we're kind of now that person now. I know that sounds a bit odd, but that's a huge symptom of childhood trauma, and a pretty common one is sort of assuming other person's lives. It's almost like an attachment thing. Overly trying to relate from a place of anxiety, which is what I was doing in that group example, which in turn isn't good for the other person, because it's just sort of, we're trying to validate, but we're so consumed in our own stuff. Another example is we might unconsciously talk from a mildly dissociated place. Another example is we might overly get into good guy or bad guy, or overly aligning with them. Like, I can't believe they did that to you, son of a bitch. You know, I always knew that about them, and blah, blah, blah. And it's almost like a way of rallying the troops or overly being on their side. And we want to be on their side, but we're doing it with a lot of like, they're so bad, can't believe they did that to you, you're so good. And sometimes that happens, but I'm more talking about an energy in a way that you'll know it. If you relate to this one, you'll know what I mean, is that we're always sort of seeking this kind of good guy, bad guy dynamic, which sometimes that's not helpful. Sometimes, like if I did that with the person who was going through the divorce, he really loved his wife, and I probably would have pissed him off further. Like, oh, she didn't, blah, blah, I'm sure she doesn't care about you. Like, that's what I mean by that. Another example is if we're offering solutions up front, classic way to be dismissive in terms of validation. Another example is imprinting our situation on the person to see if it's the same, which is another example of kind of what I did. Like, yes, I have girlfriend problems too, is sort of, it's a little bit too much of me too. But what I'm going for with this one is a little bit like when I've had members in my groups kind of say, is it like that thing when the person does this and la, 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 and it's got nothing to do with it, and they're kind of off the mark. Another example is getting out of the situation ASAP for fear of being trapped in the other person's pain. Another thing that is similar to what I did there. I think at the heart of it, when it comes to giving validation, our inner children are triggered around validation because they feel like they are either a garbage kid and what they say will never be good enough, or the pain is too much in being in that space with the person, with somebody who is in pain, again, meaning like their childhood, or we go into it fixing or taking it over. I find it's kind of in that ballpark of those two things. Let's look at an infographic. You guys know I love these things to explain this further. I like to look at issues and symptoms on a spectrum. This is what I see in childhood trauma survivors, people in my groups, myself, is around the trigger around giving validation. On the left, we might, on this spectrum, we might, need an exit if someone is in pain in some way. Like, we still might be able to kind of power through it, but we're really uncomfortable and we want to get out of there in a quick way. We need an exit. We might dissociate mildly, and I can explain more about that later, or we might try to shut it down like the way that I did. And what I mean by that is I tried to shut it down by saying, me too, I'm having girlfriend problem too, go us. So that's what I mean about what it means to be on the left, is that the person who's giving the validation is feeling overwhelmed and by the person's stuff, and they may need to go into a protective mode, which is what I did. And I've also done this too. On the right, we might totally absorb the person's stuff. We mildly dissociate. Both parties will do this. Or we might overly empathize. We might overly talk. And I think that the trigger underneath that is feeling like what we say and what we do is not good enough, which is sort of a function of shame. So you could see how you think about how you're wired. Are you more wired about protection? Are you more wired about shame when giving validation? Or what is going on for your inner child there, or your trauma response? Try not to see the person on the left as like being cold or nasty. They are overwhelmed and they may try to be present, but they may emotionally leave or try to contain the upset like I did in that group. And both can dissociate, but in different ways for different reasons. And by dissociate, I mean go into our heads, go a little bit spacey, become either too cerebral, or sort of leave the conversation while we're still sitting there with the person, we're not present. The person who dissociates a little on the left is about getting out of there ASAP and not being present. And the person on the right is kind of drowning and not good enough, like danger, danger kind of a thing, which is also a way to not be present. If you're new to me or new to the channel, welcome. If you like this video, at the end of the video, you can hit some buttons on the screen. You can't miss with any of the buttons. And if you find that this video is helpful to you and to your recovery, you can consider supporting the work that goes into this channel over at my Patreon. I don't have any third parties or sponsorships or products to plug on this channel because I feel like it mucks stuff up for the viewer. So please take that into consideration. If you're interested in doing some trauma work, you can check out some e-course work work that I have on my website. There are 3 courses: the Genogram, the Family Rules, as well as the Children's Bill of Rights. My website is also a good place to sort of say hi or get in touch with me. And you can also get in touch with me or check out my stuff on TikTok or Instagram, and I will have all the links in the description below. So, like with my story about giving validation in my own group and my attempt to dismantle a bomb going off, let's do a little bit of work around figuring out what your inner child believes when it comes to them giving validation. So here are some journaling prompts for you guys to think about around this issue of when we get triggered and why we get triggered. The first journal prompt is, what did your parents model to you about giving validation? What would each of them, if you had 2 parents or your caregivers or whatever, even if you grew up in foster care, think about an adult that you were with the longest. What would they say to a long-term coworker who is getting a divorce, or they just lost a long-term pet, or a family, one of their spouse or their kids are in the hospital? How would your parents validate? What would be going on there? Is to think about that, and also to think about, how did your family system as a whole, siblings, parents, whatever, what was their style of validation amongst each other? Would there be fakeness, insincerity, over-the-top reactions? Would they be getting out of things or giving a canned response? Think about how the family talks to each other when somebody else was in pain. In my family, there was always like a half acknowledgement about the pain, but then they would quickly move into criticizing the person for being in the pain too long. Like a day 2 of a really bad breakup. Well, you need to get beyond this now. I'm not going to be sitting around and watching you mope around and that energy all kind of day. That's what I mean about how a family can really sort of, it's confusing, half acknowledge it, but then quickly criticize. So that's the first journal prompt. The second journal prompt is, what do you believe about yourself when you are in the position to validate or sit in somebody's space when they are in pain? Does your inner child want to take it all away for the person and tries to? Does your inner child feel that being around others who are in pain is intolerable to them and they got to get out of there? Does your inner child feel that whatever they say or whatever they do is futile because they're not a good kid? The third prompt isn't a prompt. It's about consciously trying to be practicing good enough validation, or simply, starting to jumpstart the idea that you're a good enough person, that you're a lovable person, that what you say is good enough even if you make a mistake. And it's kind of the antidote to the inner child kind of freaking out about giving validation. I think that the idea of being lovable and good enough and okay to make mistakes, and that you're just a human being on the planet like the rest of us, and that you're a good person, is really the foundation that I'm trying to sort of build in my own practice with my clients, because I find that everything works if we have that foundation going on. So when we're sitting across from someone who is in pain, imagine if we stepped outside of the freak out and just practice, it's good enough to say, I don't really know what to say, but I can only imagine what you're going through. Can I sit with you? Or that we don't try to take it all over, or we just kind of say, maybe if you want to tell me more about it, I would just sort of like to listen. Or just to say, like, if you don't know what to say, I would just like to sit with you. Or to say, if this is too much, maybe I can call you later on tonight and check in on you. And that is sort of, I find, I couldn't get there unless I knew that it was, A, that it's okay to do those things, and B, that I was a good person and I wasn't bad for any kind of response that I had. My inner child would look at a lens. It didn't matter what I said, it was always bad. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get across with this one, is a practice of being good enough, and it's good enough to not know what to do, but it's certainly okay to just sort of be present for the person. Even if you don't know what to say. The fourth journal prompt is, and this one's interesting, are you trying to do the opposite of what your parents modeled, but it still doesn't go well? And like if they were cold, or you were too warm and you go over the top, that's due to shame. I think we spend 90% of our subconscious energy trying to not be like one or both of our parents. In that exchange that I had with that group member, it's kind of a mess because there was both my parents kind of going on there. The modeling is, I also didn't want to be cold I also didn't want to be sarcastic like my dad. So most of these triggering situations around giving validation is we feel on the spot and we're a little bit caught between not wanting to be like our parents and caught between not knowing what to say. So that's why it's kind of crucial to know to put that aside and to know that you're good enough and to start practicing being present as opposed to being freaked out. So in that group, had I not had trauma, coming back to that exchange that I had with the person, had I not been a trauma survivor, I had not had trauma around this, it would be perfectly fine if I said to this gentleman, I was touched about what you were going through with the divorce and just wanted to say that I see you going through that and I can only imagine what it's like to lose a partner after so long. That's perfectly fine to say, even if it whatever. It's validation is mostly seeing the person and acknowledging the person in a good enough way. So I hope that this video was helpful to you guys. I hope you got some good bits kind of out of it, and I will leave you as always with, may you be filled with loving kindness, may you be well, may you be peaceful and at ease, and may you be joyous. And I will see you guys later.